Welcome to a very dark and special episode of Chaotic Web, as this is the most brutal story I have ever encountered. At only 11 months old, Drew Barrymore was thrown onto a set, and she seemingly never left, rising to superstardom with her hit movie E.T. and falling into addiction at a shocking 7 years old. Her mother Jade would leave her alone to adult boyfriends in exclusive Hollywood parties and squeeze Drew for every dime she was worth. Jade would expose her young child Drew to hard drugs, only to blame her when she got addicted, handcuff her, and take her to rehab against her will.
They drove me here in the middle of the night and they walked me right through those 2 doors. And when you go through those 2 doors, you do not come out. And I was there for a year and a half and I hated it. I kicked, I screamed. 1 minute you're at movie premieres and clubbing, and the next minute you're in a full-blown institution with barbed wire everywhere, and you can't get out.
Drew Barrymore beat every statistic, but not without a brutal fight and divorce from her own mother at only 14 years old, and an entire book deal exploiting the whole ordeal before she even had a chance to turn 18. Now join me as I take you deep into the scariest parties in LA and through the dark, lonely streets of Brooklyn as we dive deep into the tragic story of Drew Barrymore. But first, a word from our sponsor. This episode of Deep Dive is sponsored by EveryPlate. Now, we love EveryPlate because it is America's best value meal kit. Meals are 25% cheaper than grocery shopping, as you are only paying for what you actually need, with pre-proportioned ingredients and 50% cheaper than your average fast casual takeout meal. Plus, EveryPlate recipes include only the highest quality ingredients, including sustainably sourced seafood, so you know your meals are fresh and flavorful. You can even customize your EveryPlate meals to your liking, with options to swap proteins and sides. I love the variety of delicious meal options EveryPlate provides, with 26 tasty and affordable recipes to choose from each week. EveryPlate has been so convenient lately, and the recipes we chose were quick and easy to cook on a busy weeknight. So start your summer off on the right bite with Big Batch Faves, EveryPlate's new selection of hearty meals perfect for summer gatherings. Think Tex-Mex black bean chili, but double the serving size so you can cook once and eat twice. Get started with EveryPlate for $1.49 per meal by going to everyplate.com and entering our code DEEPDIVE149. We truly love how affordable EveryPlate is, so don't forget, for $1.49 per meal, use code DEEPDIVE149 at everyplate.com. Now let's get back into the dark, dark childhood of Drew Barrymore. Now, like I said, the story of Drew Barrymore is a dark one, and it begins before she was even born. See, her father and mother were in a very violent and abusive relationship. Drew's mother recounted that she thought they could fix their relationship with a baby. However, it did exactly the opposite. One day while Drew was still in her mother's stomach, her mother and father would get into a blowout argument. Drew recalled that he, quote, raged at her all the time. Then one night, she said he went berserk and beat her up. He hit her and kicked her in the stomach. I suppose he was trying to make me inside her. Finally though, someone heard cries and came to her rescue and took her to the hospital. So all of this happened before Drew was even born, and her life would prove to be even more tumultuous. Now, we know Drew Barrymore as one of the most iconic and prolific actresses of our generation, and although she is a mega talented actress, she was also destined for this life whether she wanted it or not. See, Drew Barrymore was born to a family of all actors, and I'm not joking, like all the way up to her great-grandfather and great-grandmother, almost everyone was an actor with the maiden name Drew Barrymore. This bloodline goes all the way back to King Charles III. That's how long Drew and her family have been acting. The most prolific actor being her father, an actor by the name of John Drew Barrymore. Now, many of these actors were riddled with and alcohol abuse, unfortunately, even including her elusive father John, who sadly at only 15 years old was taken advantage of by his stepmother at the time. This led to a string of alcohol and drug abuse that lasted him his entire acting career until he died at only age 60. So clearly the Barrymore family was well acquainted with the woes of Hollywood and alcohol. But their biggest addiction by far was fame. And Drew's mother would make sure that her daughter was a star, no matter the cost. She would begin auditioning Drew, her newborn baby daughter, almost immediately. And when Drew was merely 11 months old, she was cast in her first commercial. Needless to say, much like Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen, Drew's future was sort of written before she even had a say in it. Now, Drew revealed in her book, Little Girl Lost, that I'm gonna be quoting throughout this entire video, and just so you know, it's from her like 14-year-old point of view, and she is so wildly intelligent. But in this book, she would chronicle her parents' relationship and how wildly tumultuous her relationship with her mother was, stating, "Growing up as an only child, raised by a single working mother, I was riddled by insecurity, always fearing that people wouldn't like me. How could they? My father hates me, my mother likes me only for the money I earn. And I know for damn sure that I'm nothing but a worthless piece of flesh. When I was younger, she was never there for me. That's the way I felt, at least. And these days, she takes everything out on me. I mean, she is always so negative. She compares me to my friends. She's greedy with all our money, hardly giving me any. She's all business and no pleasure. And I think she gives me too much in some ways and not enough in other ways." So making money for her parents seemed to be the main objective. And what better way for her to do so than to start acting? But Drew wouldn't be acting in just anything. See, I've long questioned the morals and ethics involving children in horror movies. Not just because of the brutality and gore, but because of the general nature of the films as well. We are talking about minors here. Like you saw in last week's Shelby search bar, Misha Barton's first acting role was in a movie called Lawn Dogs, in which she befriends a 21-year-old man at only 11 years old. And things start to get more private. Now, much like many young actors getting their start, Drew's first movie would be an absolutely brutal horror movie based around mind control, LSD ketamine experiments, and deprivation tanks. Along this audition process for various depraved horror films, Drew at only age 6 would audition for Hollywood director Steven Spielberg's all-new cutting-edge horror movie, Poltergeist. She immediately went in and, quote, lied her face off.
That's right. Meeting Steven Spielberg.
Yeah.
And you were, how old at the first? Six years old.
And I lied to him. I lied my face off. I told him I was in a rock and roll band. I was a drummer, of course, because drummers are the coolest. And that I was a cook, and you know, I mean, funny enough, I went to meet on a movie called Poltergeist, and the director, Toby Hooper, wasn't there that day, but Steven, who was the producer, was filling in for him, and I felt like I had him in my butterfly net. I was so excited. Like Pippi Longstocking was my hero, so like I just felt like girls can do anything. You know, there's no ceiling, and I sold myself and like told my little stories, and I was like, and he was like, you know what? You're not right for this. And I was like, oh, okay. And he's like, but I'm making another movie, and I think you should come audition for that. And I was like, oh yeah, okay, sure. I'm sure he won't call. And he did, and I went in for it, and it was a movie called This Boy's Life. And after numerous auditions, I got that, which later became a different title called E.T.
Now, she would be cast in the iconic role of Elliot's younger sister, Gertie, who would be dazzled by their new extraterrestrial best friend. And Drew seemed to be actually dazzled by E.T. See, growing up in the entertainment industry is a lonely existence. Drew once said she'd walk into a restaurant or some room where there were other kids and sensed that everyone was looking at her, thinking, I'm sure she's the biggest snob or brat on earth. But Drew says, quote, I wasn't. I was really this frail little thing who wanted to shout, hey, I didn't want to be famous. I just want to be loved. I'm scared. I don't know how to deal with this. But Drew would find a friend in the highly detailed extraterrestrial prop that played E.T., stating in her book, I was a 6-year-old girl who always preferred make-believe and fantasy and playing dress up to reality. Anything where I could lose myself in another character. And then I was introduced to this wonderful, cute, wrinkled creature named E.T. I fell in love. To me, E.T. was extremely real. Yes, I knew he was something Steven Spielberg created, but I actually believed in him. I could touch him, hug him, kiss him. He put his arm around me. From the moment I saw him, E.T. instantly became my best friend. On lunch breaks, I used to take my food into the room where he was kept, sit down beside him, and carry on a conversation while I ate. I talked to him about my mother and where we lived. If it was cold outside, I wrapped a scarf around his neck. I was always excited to be with him. Occasionally, some of the older crew members sat down with us and tried speaking to E.T. When he didn't answer, they asked us how come he only talked to me and not to them. I would say he's very shy. Drew would later lead on that a PA told her that we found you over there just talking away to E.T. And so we let the director Steven know. And so Steven from that time on appointed 2 guys to keep E.T. alive. So whenever you came over to talk to him, he could actually react to you. This led to a groundbreaking performance by 6-year-old Drew Barrymore and completely catapulted her career. One of the first movies after E.T. would be about a young girl who is caught in the middle of her 2 actor parents fighting over her until she gets emancipated to live with her nanny. And y'all, art would truly imitate life with this one, but we'll get into that later in the video. So after E.T., Drew, even at 6 years old, was a bona fide celebrity. Thus, her mother began taking her out to various parties and clubs to soak up that sweet limelight. However, these environments were barely for adults, and definitely not for children. This didn't stop Jade Barrymore, Drew's mother, from bringing her young daughter to Studio 54, one of the most legendary nightclubs known for the disco, but also known for promiscuity and drug use. As Drew's mother kept bringing Drew to these events, she would begin leaving Drew to party off by herself. Drew was now a lone wolf at 7 years old in the big bad city of Hollywood, California. Now, by the next year, Drew would already start smoking cigarettes. She said she recounted, well, if I smoke cigarettes, then I can drink. I started drinking alcohol with friends when I slept over at their houses, just sneaking a drink here, a beer there. After a while though, drinking became the only way I thought I could have fun. Only I didn't drink to have fun. I drank to get drunk. Now, the Barrymores, while they were highly respected in the theater and arts, were known to be heavy drinkers. And that apple, unfortunately, didn't fall far from the tree, as Drew would have her experience with alcohol at only 8 years old, drinking 2 glasses of champagne. She said she enjoyed the alcohol as it helped her escape her problems for just a moment, which, y'all, I find really sad, because like no 8-year-old should be stressed and overworked that they feel like they have to turn to alcohol for some sense of relief. Like, how messed up is that? Now, by the very next year, she had become dependent on alcohol at only 9 years of age. Now, Drew begins detailing how this spiraled into her transforming into a full-blown club hopper without her mom entirely. See, Drew became addicted to the nightlife, the booming music, everyone knowing exactly who she was, and getting that same recognition she so desperately yearned for on the set of those movies, saying, quote, "I was also a club hopper at 10, as much as someone that age can be. I would sleep over at a friend's house and we would sneak out. One time, a magazine ran a picture of me dancing and a headline that said, 'Drew Barrymore dancing at 2 a.m. Shouldn't she be in bed?' Maybe other kids that age should have been in bed, but that wasn't for me. I didn't care what anyone thought. I was accepted in the club world. I felt I belonged and I wanted to be there." After a while though, I started thinking, well, this is getting boring now, so let's try something even better. If I can drink, I can smoke. There's nothing to it. When I was 10 and a half, I was sitting in the back seat of a car driven by a friend's mother. She started smoking. I'd wanted to try marijuana for a long time, but I was afraid that if I asked, she'd say, "No way, Drew, you're too young." However, she offered me some and I said, "Sure, I'll try it." I was shocked, but she had a look that seemed to say, "Isn't it cute? A little girl getting stoned." Eventually, that got boring too, and my addict mind told me, well, if smoking is cute, it'll also be cute to get into the heavier stuff. Like, my usage was gradual, but what I did kept getting worse and worse, and I didn't care what anybody else thought about me. The higher I got, the happier I imagined myself, the more miserable I actually was. One thing Drew wasn't even allowed was sugar, saying, quote, "My mom wouldn't let me eat sugar. Studio 54 and alcohol were totally fine, but don't touch that sugar." And I did. I snuck chocolate in the closet. All the other habits were out in the open, but the sugar wasn't in the closet thing. Literally, I would hide it in a box in my closet. Now remember, Drew was doing some pretty hardcore substances. It didn't just stop at parties, as by 12 years old, Drew had developed a dependency on the intense upper. Now, this was a very strange time for Drew, as the hype from E.T. and other movies she'd done as a young child were sort of fading away. As Drew was getting older and older, the Golden Globes and the People's Choice Awards were keeping Drew out later than ever, but if she wanted to go out alone for a non-work related event, that was a big no-no according to Jade. But the biggest question for me, y'all, is like, who on earth would enable a child to engage in this type of behavior? Well, her father was apparently distant through all of this, and her mother takes a really interesting approach of justifying the situation. In an interview with Oprah, her mother claimed that she would not be attending bars with her daughter.
Where were you when she was going to parties and bars at 9?
I was never with her at bars at 9, but I would go with her to parties. There were a lot of industry functions and then private social/business functions. And when we got there, we would stay together for time. Then she would go her way and I would go my way. And not knowing about the problem, I was not as scrutinizing as I should have been.
You just decided to just let her have some space?
Yes.
9 or 10, that's exactly the age where you need some guidance, some definition, you don't need a parent to back off and give you space at 9 or 10, especially if you were where Drew was at that time.
Part of it was the fact that I didn't have a dad. I felt like my mom was abandoning me because she was always off at work.
Do you know now how you got to be so confused? I mean, how does a person born who looks like you do, who comes from the kind of ancestry that you come from, the kind of family, and is friends with Spielberg and E.T., how do you get to be so depressed? How does that happen? How could you not look in the mirror and think you were beautiful? How could you not think, gee, this is a wonderful life and I'm going to do everything to protect it?
I never looked in the mirror and thought I was beautiful. I always had the lowest self-esteem of anybody I knew. And
so you'd look in the mirror and think what?
That I was overweight, that I had a round face, my eyes weren't good enough, my hair wasn't good enough, my legs were too short, my waist was too big, my feet were too big, my teeth weren't straight enough. I mean, just every little detail wasn't right.
Are you at a point in your life now where you can accept that this is who you are? Because I went through this, and it took me a long time to get to the point where I could really just accept that I don't have that. That is not what I have. This is what I have, and I'm going to have to work with this. Are you there yet?
Yeah, I'm there. It's scary, because I want to stay sober so bad. And there is a possibility that I could slip again. But I feel so confident right now in the fact that I do want to stay sober, that I think that I feel that I have a really good chance at achieving sobriety for,
Although now it's a known fact that she had been the one bringing Drew with her to Studio 54 to party with the Hollywood elites. Drew claimed that she would party with people she considered her friends, and that looking back, she can clearly see that they were not really her friends at all. And y'all, it's such a scary Hollywood thing to imagine a room full of adults partying with a child and just acting like it's normal. It's so disturbing that nobody really stepped in and took control of the situation, because Drew was only 9 years old. Definitely not old enough to be calling the shots. Now, between the ages of 9 and 10, Drew's work dried up for a bit. She went to a school in a twisted mess of addiction that she was able to completely conceal due to her amazing acting abilities as a child. But after a year, Drew and her mother got the call that she was cast in a movie called Babes in Toyland that she would need to film in Munich, Germany. When she was in Germany filming Babes in Toyland, grown rocker Rod Stewart would party the night away with an 11-year-old Drew Barrymore, getting completely delirious into the wee hours of the night and nearly getting kicked out of the hotel they were staying in. Rod invited Drew to go on tour with him, and Drew's mother debated, but ultimately said no. At this point, drinking was the only way an 11-year-old Drew Barrymore knew how to have fun. And when her mother said no, she envisioned the tour bus of fun leaving her behind, the only happiness she knew. Now, this is when Drew would fall completely into substances for happiness and pick up a gnarly addiction. See, when Drew was drinking and smoking, Hollywood studios didn't seem to bat an eye at it. But when word of Drew's addiction got around, she began being blackballed across the entertainment industry. Producers didn't want to hire such a young girl with such an extreme addiction. Around this time, Drew was in a public limbo. It was before the news of Drew's addiction was public knowledge, but after all the Hollywood producers had caught wind. Drew was also a very public part of the First Lady Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign against drugs. So she was being placed on a pedestal nonetheless. Now, when Drew's mother/manager alerted her that she was cast in the movie See You in the Morning, a young Drew, who usually loved to work, was completely against the job. She would have to leave her friends she'd made, and she wouldn't be able to indulge in the substances they'd all craved. She didn't want to do the movie, but her mother made her. According to Drew, this was the most depressing 4 months of her life, and truly flipped her mom into the complete enemy. During this time in New York City, Drew would start amassing more older friends, including her 17-year-old model friend named Stacy, who a 12-year-old Drew Barrymore would start going out to fashionable clubs with. Now, Drew would list multiple experiences of huge celebrities sneaking her into clubs while she wasn't even a teenager yet. A job that seemed like it could have been an escape from the riddled party scene of LA had found Drew this new movie cycle as well. This time, it was in the form of her fleeting, very ambiguously aged boyfriend, Bobby, and her new 17-year-old model friend, Stacy. Over the few months she was in New York, they would get her very well acquainted with the party scene. But after she got back from filming and heading home to Los Angeles, she would discover many of her friends that she'd previously indulged in substances with had gone to treatment and gotten clean. Thus, Drew again was all alone. She used this time to make more stoner friends, and by the time prom had come around, Drew was doing line after line with the older kids. Now, Drew's mother never had a serious problem with her substance abuse until she was no longer able to work. She would reprimand her, fight her, and ground her, but to no avail. Jade really sort of let anything slide. However, the tumultuous period Jade and Drew had experienced in New York City caused Drew's mother to see the warning flashes of what was to come, and she would begin making moves to set up an involuntary hold on Drew. Drew also wasn't being hired. The New York City movie with Farrah Fawcett had ended, and she wasn't making anyone any money. So her mother and manager decided finally at that moment to reach out to outside sources. During a blowout fight during one of the countless nights Drew stayed out past her curfew, she called and told her mom to get out of her house and that she didn't deserve to live there. Her mother agreed, but when Drew came back and saw that her mother was still upstairs, she was livid. She began destroying her mother's house, but her mother wasn't reacting as she usually does. Jade would stand her ground while Drew tore the apartment to shreds. Drew knew her mother's rule of not drinking in the house, so Drew knew she had to do just that to send Jade over the edge. She went to the refrigerator and pulled out an ice-cold beer. Her mother told her not to drink it, and that's when Drew stormed into her room and slammed the door. Through the door, a 13-year-old Drew could hear her mother on the phone saying, "She's very bad. You need to come over right now and pick her up." Panic shot through Drew's body as if she was being scalded by hot water. Oh, she thought, the cops are coming. What am I going to do now? But it actually wasn't the cops at all. See, remember that friend Drew had that sobered up while she was in New York City? Well, Drew's mother had phoned her mother and asked how she got clean. This is when Drew's friend's mother would reveal the cure was Betty Wyman's clinic called ASAP Treatment Center. Now, Betty Wyman has been caught up in numerous stories that we've investigated and was clearly an early player at setting up the corrupt California treatment system. But what's very interesting about the telling of this part of the story is up until this point, the point of view has been mostly from a 14-year-old Drew Barrymore. But this portion of the book is conveniently from her mother's point of view. And it's basically a long ad for the recovery center Drew was placed in. Now, I'm gonna get into this later, but Drew does defend her treatment process, saying, "I was locked up at 13 years old, boo-hoo, I needed it." But I can't help but read the subtext of this story. Her mother states multiple times that Drew hated every second of that treatment center while she was there, and it was full of young girls just like her. Now, Drew only stayed in this rehab facility for a record-breaking 11 days, but she didn't leave because of relapse. She left for the far away from home film commitment that her mother was not letting go. Now remember, Drew didn't even want to work at this point, and she is being revived back to life as a young 13-year-old girl. Yet Jade Barrymore had her mind set on Drew's career. Drew would leave rehab in the middle of treatment to go back to work. Betty Wyman would send a past patient / handler with her to make sure she didn't mess up. Now here they equate her arguing with her mom to drinking, and that's where it gets testy. Betty says if Drew is so much has a drink or argues with her mother to call her immediately for reinforcement. Drew filmed this movie far away from home in a small town with nothing to do but 3 bars. But she remarkably stayed sober. She said it was the first time she'd gotten back into her work since Cat's Eye. Now, how these huge studios were okay with hiring a meek and weak young 13-year-old girl straight out of rehab and sending her back when they were done working with her, I'll never know. But on September 5th, the movie wrapped and she returned back to ASAP Recovery Center ASAP. Now remember, this was what Drew described as her prison. She had had a good attitude, but she was furious that she had to go back. Against the wishes of the doctors and therapists at ASAP Recovery, Drew's mother had another film obligation for her, this time in Manhattan for 1 week. Drew's mother figured she'd been doing fine, as she'd been sober for 78 days to this point, but her mother was wrong. Drew knew it too. She felt a sick feeling in her stomach on the plane on the way to New York City. She knew it couldn't be good. Her mother would leave her completely alone, no sober coach, no nothing, and let her go back to hang out with Stacy at the old clubs they used to frequent. While they were there, all of Drew's friends started doing lines. She declined as she was scared of Betty Wyman and knew she would get arrested the second she went back. However, her friends asked her one more time after they did it, and Drew caved in. Drew recalls the dramatic scene on the dance floor. A 13-year-old Drew, minutes after her last line, sobbing about 78 days of sobriety lost. Now, she hadn't even had 1 minute. Which, y'all, this just goes to show that they're putting the pressure of the social construct of sobriety on such a young teen girl. I mean, they even go as far as to go into dry periods versus sober periods. And I just think it's all a little much. I mean, throughout her book, Betty and Drew really sympathize with her mom, but this all goes back to her allowing her and encouraging her to go to these adult parties and then leaving her completely unsupervised with no guidance. If her mother hadn't done that, she wouldn't be having to differentiate the 12 steps as a 13-year-old. That's barely a step for every year she was born at that point. Anyway, the tears wear off and Drew convinced her friend Stacy to do just one more line with her. They perk up, get their noses sore, and dance the night away without a care in the world. Now, Drew goes back to where they were staying and tells her mother that she's sober and everything is fine. Jade actually buys this, letting Drew get completely away scot-free. But the looming fear of the test was still imminent in a 13-year-old Drew's mind. Thus, she decided she'd already messed up. Why not go all the way? Her and Stacy, who was now 18, devised a plan to go to Hawaii with nothing but their handbags. They drove to LaGuardia Airport, hopped on a plane to Los Angeles, went shopping with her mother's stolen credit card, and shielded themselves with very wishy-washy alibis to her mother along the way that she, for the most part, believed. However, when Drew wasn't home the next morning, which again, y'all, Jade Jade is letting her stay out all night in New York City. Jade told Drew she was calling the cops. Her mother then canceled the stolen credit card and immediately alerted Drew that she had limited time. Drew and Stacy fled from friend's house to friend's house until they were only an hour and a half from their escape to Hawaii. It was a mad dash against the clock. However, this is when Drew would walk back into her room where she would see a strange man and woman in her doorframe. Drew, who wasn't dressed and still had lines she'd just done, told them to get out until she got dressed. They didn't listen and handcuffed Drew while she was still unclothed. They took her back to Betty Wyman's clinic. The two goons for the hospital asked about E.T. when she was in the back seat, silent. They even asked her for an autograph when they uncuffed her. Drew was heading back into her personal prison at the lowest of lows, and fans were asking for autographs on her way into her personal hell. This time, it was even worse too. Drew was allegedly tackled to the ground by 4 techs after she verbalized that she didn't like the way another student was being treated. And Betty Wyman held the treatment over Jade's head as well, saying, if you want your daughter to be sober, you have to abide by even stricter rules and give Betty even more control over you and your daughter, including the job of Drew's manager. Yeah, that's what the book says. I don't know if she was taking percentages, so I guess her mother relinquished the power of being Drew Barrymore's manager to Betty Wyman. A mastermind therapist. It's very, very sketch and sounds a lot like the Britney Spears situation. During this time, they kept Jade away from Drew and didn't tell Drew why. She thought her mother had abandoned her, and she really did. When Drew would ask if she could bring something to the hospital, Jade would say, when I have time. The estrangement between a 13-year-old Drew and her adult mother was inappropriate to say the least. Jade had a duty to her daughter, and after making wrong choice after wrong choice, she was barely even aiding in the recovery process of her 13-year-old daughter. Treatment seemed to get even more severe, and Betty Wyman believed, quote, Drew had to confront herself first. She had to be dragged kicking and screaming if need be. Now, in treatment, Drew met a boy whom she really hit it off with, and when they were caught talking together in a storage room, Drew was given ITP for 3 days, what Betty Wyman refers to as intensive treatment program, which can most closely be related to solitary confinement. She needed to write a paper while in there as well, and the assignment was cruel. The first topic Betty gave her was, is Rick just another number on your long list? Attempting to demean, degrade, and humiliate Drew for a natural human emotion she had towards her new crush, Rick. Drew was given ITP 15 times in her first month and a half, which if it was only 3 days each and she didn't get it the first couple of days, that meant she spent nearly all her time in solitary confinement, in between grueling therapy session after therapy session. One day, when Lori called Drew into the office, they very coldly alerted her that her grandfather had died. Betty snapped, "Deal with it, Drew," while Drew was wallowing in her own tears. Drew even attempted to escape the facility through the window, but a tech found her and put her back in ITP. Betty was physically and mentally monitoring and testing Drew, but as Drew was being placed in unimaginable conditions over and over, she finally decided to cooperate and did whatever they said until she was given a pass to Growth Group, a section of the Betty Wyman recovery process where they all go out and do fun things, showing that you can have fun without substances. For most of the attendees, this was their first time they were bowling, doing barbecues, and going to concerts while sober. But to Drew, this was her first time ever even doing these things. See, the entertainment industry had swallowed her up from the age of 11 months old to her present day. If she was, quote, having fun, it was either in front of a camera, in a club, or with a bunch of age-inappropriate celebrities. This was her first time trying normal kid things. And remember, Drew is still only 13 years old. Now, Drew's mother would start to visit her again. One night, Drew recalled her mother came to visit, but arrived 5 minutes after visiting hours had ended. Jade persuaded a nurse to let her back, where she greeted Drew and slipped her a script. Drew felt like her only worth to her mother was money. She said, quote, "Can't you just be my mom for a goddamn minute? Don't you listen to a thing I say? I don't want you to be my manager. I want a mother. Other kids' parents bring them McDonald's. Why do I have to get scripts? Jade shrank out of the hospital distraught, realizing she'd made a huge mistake. In the following family session, Drew pleaded to her mother, "Sometimes I don't want to work," she said. "I just want to be a little girl. I just want to be ordinary Drew, not Drew Barrymore." Her mother would breadcrumb her with a pair of slippers, and it worked. Drew writing in her book that kids were always getting little gifts or presents. Everyone, it seemed, except me. Oh, what did my mother bring me? A script. She wanted me to work, which I knew I wasn't ready for. I told her that in the session after I blew up at her. And though she said she understood, I wondered. But when I finally got that special little something that told me she cared and that she loved me for being me, well, it sounds stupid, but it made a difference. Drew went through the motions and was eventually given her discharge date from Betty Wyman's rehab center. However, one day after Drew received this news, so did the National Enquirer. Which, y'all, again, how these internal affairs at rehabs get leaked to the media, usually the call is coming from inside the house. But the scene was described in Drew's book as follows. In the final days of December 1988, Drew Barrymore was experiencing the worst time in her life. She had spent the past 6 months undergoing intensive rehabilitation treatment for a 4-year addiction to alcohol and drugs, an addiction that had turned her into a bloated and bruised remnant of her public image. That whole enterprise had been hellish enough to make Drew think she'd been through everything life could possibly throw her way. However, on the eve of her long-anticipated pre-Christmas discharge from the ASAP Family Treatment Center, the private and alcohol hospital where she had been residing off and on since early summer, Drew and her mother Jade Barrymore were delivered a startling jolt of bad news. The gossipy tabloid, the National Enquirer, was about to blow the lid off her tightly guarded secret, whether or not she approved. Drew's struggle with booze and drugs was about to be made public. And there was a serious concern among those close to her about the effect that this shocking revelation would have on a 13-year-old Drew, who, again, at only 13 years old, was re-entering the world as fragile as a baby doe learning to walk. Drew stating in her book, "My mental state at that point was delicate and raw. Excited to go home, I was struggling to digest everything I'd been dealing with in treatment. I'd been learning how to manage again in the outside world. I'd finally gotten reacquainted with myself after years of masquerading as someone else. It was a lot to contend with. The prospect of stepping beyond the safety of the hospital was frightening enough by itself. I didn't need to be worrying about gossip columns magnifying and distorting the difficulties I'd been trying to overcome. Needless to say, I was furious. While everyone else, including my mother and my therapist, grew dizzy from concern, I erupted into a rage. A huge, horrible, angry outrage that evidenced the dark and temperamental side I inherited from my Barrymore ancestors. It seemed to vent my frustration some, and then I cried. I cried so hard I found myself huddled in bed, trembling uncontrollably. A low self-esteem had plagued me for years, almost as far back as I can recall, and repairing it had been a major part of my treatment at ASAP. Consequently, imagining the god-awful headlines, Drew Barrymore addict at 12 years old, or Barrymore burns out in teens, and the impression people would get of me was all my worst possible fears come true. I would have been the last person on earth to deny my problems, but I wanted to have the option of confessing them. In the position I found myself in, I felt hopeless, like a drowning swimmer gasping for air. I didn't know what to do, and I fell into the worst depression. Her book continues on, was the little girl from E.T. really battling a cocaine and alcohol addiction? Betty Wyman worried about Drew's reaction. Her condition was fragile enough without the attention. Her re-emergence into the outside world posed enough temptations. She didn't need the burden of public shame and humiliation piled on top of that. Miraculously though, through the frenzy, Drew remained relatively stable bold and centered. Compared to her mother, she was the Rock of Gibraltar. She even hatched the plan to tell her story in her own words to People magazine. If her alcohol tribulations were going to be public, she determined that at the very least, the story should be factual and honest. And if possible, it should act as either a deterrent or an inspiration to people her own age who might also be struggling with similar problems. Drew left the ASAP hospital on December 21st. It was 3 months and 1 week after she'd been brought in forcibly from her home by the 2 private detectives, with her hands cuffed behind her back after a delirious 48-hour cross-country romp. She walked out 25 pounds lighter than when she'd arrived. The National Enquirer's story was out that week, and the telephone rang off the hook. Friends, people Drew had worked with, acquaintances from years back, all wanted to know if it was true, and if it was, how Drew was doing. Reporters stalked the front of their house. They had to sneak outside through back doors and neighbors' cars. It wasn't a pleasant scene. After all, it was a hard scandal for a young, 13-year-old Drew Barrymore. However, this didn't stop much, as only 1 week after being discharged, Drew immediately was hired by the Disney company to do an after-school special about drug use with outspoken child rights activist and actor Corey Feldman. Now, this book described Drew relapsing on a joint and the clinic pressuring her into feeling bad about it. And again, y'all, this was the 80s, a completely different time. However, during this time, she would date a 22-year-old actor named Peter. And they named this off in the book like it's a good thing, like they do with all of Drew's predatory relationships with adult men. Again, y'all, she was 13, but like I said, she switched from sober to California sober and hid it for months. The guilt of returning to caused the now 14-year-old Drew Barrymore to one day dive behind her mother's vehicle while she was pulling it out of the driveway. Her mother slammed on the brakes and stopped her car. She lived and still didn't tell her mother about her new California sober habit. Now, this is where the story gets very strange. Now, her mother and Peter strangely started to grow close. I don't know if the mom was trying to make Drew jealous. It seems like they have a weirdly competitive relationship, but these Hollywood mothers are pretty grotesque sometimes. And Drew actually became an outsider of her own family. Her mom became better friends with her boyfriend than she was with her mom or her boyfriend. The fights with her mother resumed, and she attempted to run away. She went back home for a few tumultuous months until Drew decided it was time to move out, which I don't know how she was able to threaten that and then actually do it at only 14 years old, but she did. And somehow when she moved out, Peter stayed and lived with her mother. It's unclear to me whether they were dating or not, but that sentence alone, oh, that sickens me. And the mom and Peter went to New York together without Drew. Again, he was probably more age appropriate for her mom, but maybe it's the best case scenario and they're just weird boundaryless friends. I don't know, but anyway, while they're living in LA, Drew moves out and has to get a job working the door at some club at, again, only 14 years old. She also explains that all her money from her early movies was put into a trust that she couldn't even touch, which is there a reasonable way to do that? I'm sure. But Jade, as a mother, if you were going to let her go move out on her own, she should have had more than enough money to live on. She had to scrape by during these times and was being kept away from the money she had worked so hard to earn, even at the expense of her own physical and mental health. Now, during this time, Drew had hit rock bottom again, but this time not with substances, with her depression. She called her friends over and threatened to unalive herself on her wrists. Her friends called the hospital and they took a 14-year-old Drew Barrymore to Cedars-Sinai, where her mother gave permission for them to do whatever they needed to do. On the phone, while in the hospital, Drew finally came clean and told her mother she smoked again. And her mother, without consulting Drew, sent her right back into ASAP recovery. Drew would experience the nightmare of ASAP and Betty Wyman all over again, this time with no mercy. Betty and Lori would even cruelly out her smoking in front of the entire class before she had even confessed it. They were humiliating her even more this round. The group would, quote, whip and flog and humiliate a young 14-year-old Drew with the truth. However, this was Drew's final straw with her mother, and she knew just what she had to do. One day, she stormed Betty's office and told her that she has to do something about her insane mother. That's when Betty hatched the brilliant plan to put Drew's mother in an Arizona rehab facility called the Meadows. Now, they say Jade's stay at this rehab facility was for codependency, and I'm sure that was part of it, but again, look at Drew's bloodline. And I'm sure they wouldn't mention this because the book that a lot of these quotes were in, one, is impossible to find. It has been completely wiped off the internet. And two, Drew and Betty Wyman wrote this information together, and it's kind of a push fest. Like, you'll see Drew still like swears by her treatment today, but then has like conflicting reports. We're gonna get into it. But this book is a big ad for recovery and major PR for Drew Barrymore. However, like I said, Drew's mother allegedly checked in and out of the rehab the same day and only stayed in there for 6 hours. When Drew caught wind of this, she was furious. The mother that had put her through living hell couldn't even take an ounce of what she was dealing. She told her mother, quote, "You know what? I'm gonna tell you something, and it's gonna be short and simple. I'm 14 years old. I've spent 7 months of my life in this hospital, working damn hard to get better. You've spent 6 hours in a hospital. How dare you do that when you say I'm important to you? This is important to us. Stop being so selfish. This is not about you. This is about us. This is to get you better so we can have a relationship. What do you think I'm doing in this hospital? I'm not working completely for you. I'm trying to make myself better so we can go home and live in a healthy, natural environment. And if you don't go back, I mean, if you can check out and I can't, well, that's just game playing. My life is not a little game. So if you don't go back, please don't be surprised when I don't return home." And with that note, Jade actually went back to rehab, but she began literally verbally attacking her own daughter in treatment. And Betty now had complete control over both of them. And that's how Drew's recounting of her 1988 through 1989 psychiatric hold with her mother ends, with her about to be released and no real ending. But the story picks back up outside of the book. See, this book doesn't care to mention that shortly after Drew's release, she would, quote, divorce her mother and emancipate herself. Now, most child stars actually do this to work more hours.
While traversing extreme peaks and valleys of global fame, hidden medical hospitalizations, artistic milestones, rapid adultification, and multi-layered abuse I wish on no one, I narrowly survived the toddler to train wreck pipeline. A full-fledged system has emerged. It's expertly constructed, and it's bolted in place by censoring the harm happening behind the scenes, manicuring aspirational lifestyles and outcomes, and then watching young lives tragically implode. Agents are encouraging me to look at early emancipation so I can work longer hours. This is going to increase my hireability.
And while this could have been true for Drew as well, she was in multiple predatory movies before she turned 18. Drew's mother was also clearly never her mother, and Drew knew that even from the young age of 14. Also, this is all sold in a book while Drew was still only 14. Yeah, y'all, it's hard to remember, I know I keep saying this, but this book is from the perspective of a 14-year-old. Drew Barrymore really took these low points created by Betty Wyman and her mother Jade and turned them into one of the most prolific acting careers of all time, starring in hit movies like Scream, First Kiss Baseball, and even Charlie's Angels. But before this, she had an acting career much like Alicia Silverstone, which y'all need to check out that video over on Deep Dive if you haven't. It's insane. But I want to get into some of Drew's predatory movies. Now, first, I wasn't even sure if I was going to mention this one, but I want to talk about the subtext of Conspiracy of Love. Now, y'all, Drew was in a made-for-TV movie about a grandfather and granddaughter who develop an special connection that this like caricature of a concerned mom is so against. Like any second they get to, she's like yelling and angry. It's like literally like a Victorious sketch of like people exaggerating a story. Like this woman is insane. No real person acts like this. Anyway, the mom is against the granddaughter and grandfather's relationship, so they have to keep it a secret. And the mom finds out they're still meeting up with each other and gets a restraining order against her own father, which seems like a metaphor for whoever was writing this. Like it seems like a lot is missing from this story. Like, I don't think I'm reading too much into this, but like, why would a mother get a restraining order on her own father unless it was pretty serious? And the scenes are just like weird. Like the trailer just ends with this.
We stand guilty of anything, then we stand guilty of love.
Conspiracy of love. A trial of the heart.
You're some kind of kid.
You're
some kind of grandpa.
And if the movie was called like Grandpa Mike or something, like that would be one thing, but the movie is called Conspiracy of Love. Anyways, she would also appear underage in the Amy Fisher Story, a movie about a teen who wounds the wife of an overage man she calls a lover, and she would be completely nude while underage in the movie Doppelganger. She would also star in Poison Ivy at only 17 years old. And that movie is about a quote, seductive teen who befriends an introverted high school student and schemes her ways into the lives of her wealthy family. Notice how these teen girls are always the villains yet also getting exploited. It's very interesting. Anyway, this movie even contained a nude scene of an underage Drew Barrymore, which I don't think makes it legal just because Drew's emancipation. But she would also star in Crazy that same year, a movie about a quote, trashy teen who murdered her sexually abusive stepfather, then helps get her reformed prison pen pal released on good behavior so that she can re-corrupt him. But y'all, this would all come to a head when a 17-year-old Drew Barrymore would appear completely nude on the cover of Interview magazine and have graphic shots in the magazine while she was still a minor. Now, Interview magazine recently republished all of these images in a positive light, and it's so nasty. So what is Drew Barrymore up to now? After all of these exploitative movies, Drew Barrymore would land the role of a lifetime in Wes Craven's hit movie Scream. This would elevate her career to the next level, and she would star in many, many more movies throughout her career. However, in 2016, Drew would return to rehab in Utah for alcohol binging after her divorce. However, Drew reformed very quickly and actually even got a talk show where people are dazzled by her every episode, and she's able to use these horrific life experiences to help other people and truly really actually relate to them.
That's all special effects. Or was it? One host, one time. I love my kids so much. I just want to squeeze it. Host a new daytime show.
Drew Barrymore has and will always be a legend. Her mother saw that in her as a child, Betty Wyman saw that in her as a test subject / prototype, and the world saw that in Drew Barrymore, the movie star. Now, in 2023, Drew would open up about her stay at the rehab facility one more time, letting the Los Angeles Times in on her grim reality, stating, "I will always have the they're coming mentality. It's the one thing that I unfortunately can't shake. I'm pretty sure that this will all go away at any moment. I will get locked up again and I will lose my job."
You mentioned Paris Hilton was on your show the other day, and she said something about that she was locked up and thrown into isolation.
Yeah.
And you said, "Oh yeah, I know what that's like."
My mom put me in a place that was like a full psychiatric ward. I was in a place for 1.5 years called Van Nuys Psychiatric. And you couldn't mess around in there. And if you did, you would get thrown either in the padded room or get put in stretcher restraints and tied up. Some days it was really funny. I would rile up all the girls and I'd be like, "Listen, this place, these people don't care about you. Let's show them, all right, everybody." I would totally rile the entire joint up.
If your mother had been more equipped, if she had just sat you down and said, "Drew, why are you so angry? What's wrong?"
You know, I think she created a monster and she didn't know what to do with the monster. And This was her last gasp. And I really was out of control. And I forgive her for making this choice. She probably felt like she had nowhere to turn. But I will never lose sight of this part of my story. Life is so wonderful compared to what it was in this place. I can't even believe I actually get to be where I am now. Because when I was here, I didn't see that. I thought I would be here forever. I never thought I was going to make it to somewhere better. And I'm just so happy with my life. And I don't know if I would have the life I have if it wasn't for a place like this.